Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On August 21st, 2016, at 5 o'clock 40 minutes in the morning, logging truck driver James Harrison was traveling on Highway 212, known as the Beartooth Highway, near the town of Silvergate, Montana. Thick morning fog covered the road, limiting visibility to a few dozen feet. Harrison slowed down when he spotted a strange shadow in his headlights, moving right across the median. It was a woman. She was walking barefoot, her clothes reduced to muddy rags, and her skin covered in a layer of dried blood and dirt. When the driver stopped the truck and ran up to her, the woman did not respond to his voice. She stared through him with a glassy gaze, shivering from the cold, even though the temperature was about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. James noticed that the woman's right hand was clenched into a fist so tightly that her knuckles were white. She was holding something black, like a rock or a piece of plastic. Later, when the paramedics tried to unclench her fingers to insert an IV, they realized it was a Garmin portable GPS navigator. The screen of the device was broken, and the rubberized case was covered with brown stains, the origin of which would become known only later. The woman's name was Tiffany Miller, and she was the only witness to what happened deep in Yellowstone National Park. Or so she wanted everyone to think. The story that would later shake up 3 states began on a hot August day when nothing seemed to portend trouble. On August 13, 2016, at about 16 hours and 30 minutes, a silver Ford Explorer SUV with Montana license plates crossed the border into the town of Gardner. This small settlement, located at the north entrance to Yellowstone National Park, serves as the last stronghold of civilization before the vast wilderness. The car was driven by 31-year-old architect Richard Miller, with his wife, 28-year-old Tiffany, sitting next to him. According to credit card information, at 17 hours and 15 minutes on the same day, the couple checked into the Elk Antler Lodge Motel. The administrator of the establishment, a 50-year-old woman named Sarah Jenkins, would later testify to the police. She remembered the couple because they looked like the perfect example of happy tourists, smiling, calm, and excited about their upcoming trip. Jenkins noted that Richard was asking in detail about the condition of the roads in the eastern part of the park, while Tiffany was looking at souvenirs in the lobby. That was the last time they were seen in civilian clothes and in the safety of their hotel room. On August 14, 2016, at 7 o'clock 40 minutes in the morning, surveillance cameras at a gas station in Gardner captured Richard Miller filling his car's tank and buying 2 large coffees and a 6-pack of water. Exactly an hour later, at 8:45, their SUV pulled into a gravel parking lot at the start of the Slough Creek hiking trail. This place, located in the heart of the Lamar Valley, is known for its scenic views and high concentration of wildlife, including bison and grizzly bears. The registration procedure was flawless. In the visitor logbook, which is located in a special metal box at the beginning of the route, there is an entry made by Richard's hand. He indicated the date, August 14th. The time of departure, 9:00 in the morning. The number of people, 2. And the destination, campsite number 2 ES1. The date of return was clearly written in the column Date of Return, August 16, 2016. It was an ambitious but quite feasible plan for trained hikers. A long trek deep into the wilderness with 2 nights in the open. The next 48 hours passed in silence. The world around them went on as usual, with tourists taking pictures of bison, rangers patrolling the roads, and the Miller's Ford Explorer sitting in the parking lot, covered in a layer of dust. The alarm was raised on August 16th at 18 hours and 30 minutes. According to the protocol, a patrol ranger checked the parking lot and found a car whose owners should have returned by now. Richard and Tiffany's phones were not answering. There was no cell service in this part of the park. The ranger left a standard warning under the car's windshield wiper, assuming that the tourists might have simply been delayed by fatigue. However, when the car was still there at 7 o'clock in the morning on August 17th, and the Millers had not contacted their relatives, the situation became critical. At 8 o'clock 15 minutes, the disappearance of the two people was officially announced, and a search and rescue protocol was launched. The scale of the search that unfolded in the Lamar Valley was unprecedented for that season. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a search helicopter arrived from the city of Bozeman. 3 dog teams and a group of 20 professional rescuers worked from the ground. The situation was catastrophically complicated by the weather. Around noon on August 17th, the sky became overcast with leaden clouds, and the temperature plummeted from 80 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. A cold downpour began, turning the dirt trails into viscous mud, and worse, mercilessly washing away any traces. Dog handlers reported that the dogs picked up the scent at the trailhead, but lost it 2 miles later, near a flooded creek. The rain was destroying the scents faster than the rescuers could move along the route. Visibility dropped to 50 yards, making air operations almost impossible. Nevertheless, ground teams continued to make their way to a 2x1 campsite 8 miles away. At 14 hours and 40 minutes on August 18, the second day of active searching, the advance team of rangers finally reached the site of the alleged parking lot. What they saw raised more questions than it answered. In a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, there was an orange-colored tent. It was professionally set up. The pegs were securely driven into the ground, and the tent was stretched perfectly straight. The tent was inspected with the utmost care, as if it were a crime scene. It was empty inside. The absence of people in the camp in the middle of the day was not surprising, but the contents of the tent shocked experienced searchers. The sleeping bags were gone. This could indicate that the tourists had packed some of their equipment and left. But other things remained in place, and their list did not fit into any logical picture. In the inner pocket of the tent was a Ventolin asthma inhaler. According to medical records obtained from his relatives, Richard Miller suffered from asthma and never parted with his medication, especially during physical activity in the highlands. Leaving his inhaler in the tent and going to the radial exit would have been deadly negligence for him. In addition, in the corner was a protective case with 2 professional camera lenses, the total cost of which exceeded $4,000. A photographer of Richard's caliber would hardly leave such equipment unattended in the wild forest. No signs of a struggle, blood, or torn fabric were found inside or around the tent. The rain had washed away the shoe prints, turning the ground around the camp into a muddy mess. Rescuers combed the forest within a 1-mile radius of the campsite using thermal imagers, but the dense vegetation and difficult terrain negated all efforts. The forest was silent. On August 20th, 6 days after Richard and Tiffany entered the forest, hope of finding them alive began to fade rapidly. The head of the search operation was forced to make a difficult decision to switch the search to a passive phase. This meant that the large-scale combing of the area was stopped, and the forces were focused on checking individual points and analyzing the data obtained. One story began to dominate the local press and National Park Service reports: a predator attack. The Slough Creek area is known as grizzly bear territory. Experts speculated that the couple could have come across a bear with cubs, and the predator, protecting its young, attacked the tourists and then dragged the bodies deep into the forest. The absence of sleeping bags was explained by the fact that the bear could have dragged them away with the victims, or the tourists themselves took them away, trying to arrange a temporary shelter after being injured. The version seemed logical and convenient. Nature is cruel, and such tragedies, though rare, do happen. However, one of the rangers who inspected the tent noted in his report a detail that haunted him and which the management decided not to make public. The zipper at the entrance to the tent was zipped from the inside, but there was a neat, barely noticeable cut about 4 inches long in the bottom of the fabric, made by something very sharp. It didn't look like a bear claw. It looked as if someone wanted to take a discreet peek inside before entering. August 21st, 2016, began for the people of Park County, Wyoming, with a thick pre-dawn fog that enveloped the mountain passes. It had been exactly 1 week since the Miller's silver SUV had last been caught on camera at a gas station, and 6 days since their scheduled return. While search teams in the Lamar Valley were rolling up their tents, admitting defeat to the forces of nature, events were unfolding dozens of miles away on one of America's most dangerous roads. Highway 212, known as the Bear's Tooth Highway, is considered a masterpiece of engineering, but it is also a real challenge for drivers. The winding road rises to an altitude of more than 10,000 feet, cutting through rocks and alpine meadows. At 5 o'clock, 40 minutes in the morning, a heavy logging truck driven by 50-year-old James Harrison was traveling along this road, heading toward the town of Silvergate. The driver, who had been driving for 30 years, knew every curve of the road, so he drove confidently despite the limited visibility. According to Harrison's later testimony, recorded in a police report, visibility that morning was less than 50 feet. The light from the truck's powerful headlights hit a white wall of fog, revealing only wet asphalt and a yellow dividing line. It was this stripe that became the reference point for the figure that suddenly appeared in front of the hood of the multi-ton truck. Harrison slammed on the brakes. The logging truck's pneumatic system emitted a sharp whistle. The wheels locked, and the heavy machine went yawning, stopping just a few yards from the unknown obstacle. The driver jumped out of the cab with a flashlight in his hand, ready to see a downed deer or elk, a common sight in these parts. But the beam of the lantern snatched the silhouette of a person from the darkness. It was a woman. She stood in the middle of the road, in the double solid lane, and did not even flinch from the screeching of her brakes and the blinding light of her headlights. Her appearance was so horrifying that Harrison says he froze for a moment in shock. The woman's clothes had turned into dirty rags, with holes in them showing her body, which was blue from the cold. She was barefoot. Her feet were bruised to the point of blood, the skin on her feet resembling a continuous wound covered with dirt and fine gravel. This was Tiffany Miller. However, this emaciated creature was unrecognizable as the smiling tourist who had bought coffee in Gardner's a week earlier. Her hair was a mess. Her face was covered with a network of scratches and bruises. Her lips were cracked from dehydration. But the most terrifying thing was her gaze. She looked through the driver, through the headlights, into the void. Doctors would later call this state a catatonic stupor, a protective reaction of the psyche to extreme stress. Harrison threw his jacket over her and tried to speak to her, but the woman did not respond to sounds. She stood like a statue. Only a slight trembling showed that she still had life in her. The driver immediately contacted the dispatcher by radio, calling for help. The nearest paramedic team was in the town of Cook City, just a few miles away. An ambulance crew consisting of Sarah Thompson and Michael Reed arrived at the scene at 6 hours and 15 minutes. They immediately began examining the patient. Her pulse was thready, her blood pressure was critically low, and her body temperature had dropped to 92 degrees Fahrenheit, indicating deep hypothermia. Tiffany did not resist being placed on a stretcher. Her body was unnaturally tense, her muscles were petrified. During the examination, Sarah Thompson noticed the woman's right hand. The fist was clenched so tightly that the knuckles turned white and seemed about to break through the thin parchment skin. The paramedic tried to open her fingers to gain access to the veins to insert the catheter, but the woman's hand was as if it were made of iron. It was a spasm that often occurs in mountain climbers or drowning victims, a reflexive attempt to hold on for dear life. Michael Reed helped his colleague, gently extending one finger at a time. Tiffany made a sound for the first time, a quiet, hoarse moan, not from pain, but from unwillingness to let go of what she was holding. When the palm of her hand finally opened, a small object fell onto the sheet of the stretcher. It was a Garmin iTrex portable GPS navigator. The device looked like it had been through hell. Its yellow rubberized body was darkened with dirt, and the screen's protective glass was covered with a thick web of cracks, making the image almost unreadable. However, the green light on the side was still blinking, indicating that the device was on and still working, recording coordinates even in the ambulance. But it wasn't the state of the electronics that caught the doctor's attention. Sarah Thompson, who has seen a lot of injuries in her 10 years of work in the mountains, froze as she looked at the device. The buttons of the navigator, its ribbed sides and the back cover, were covered with a dark, thick substance that had already dried and eaten into the texture of the plastic. It was not just mud or grease. The device was covered with baked blood. It was too much for a simple scratch or a broken nose. The blood filled the gaps between the joystick keys and froze into a dark crust on the screen. The paramedics exchanged anxious glances. They loaded the patient into the car and turned on the siren, heading for the Regional Medical Center in Cody, Wyoming. On the way to the hospital, Sarah Thompson took another look at Tiffany's hands. Her palms had abrasions consistent with falling on rocks, but there were no deep cuts that could explain the amount of blood on the navigator. The blood on the device she had so desperately guarded did not belong to her. Tiffany Miller had returned from the woods alone, but she had brought with her a silent witness who knew more than she could tell. And that witness was still at work, recording every second of her journey. Friends, before we continue to dive into the details of this eerie story, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment under this video, and like it. Your activity helps YouTube's algorithms promote the video so that as many people as possible can see this confusing case. Thank you for your support. On August 22, 2016, exactly one day after she was found on the highway, Tiffany Miller regained consciousness in a ward at the Cody Regional Medical Center. Her condition had stabilized, although doctors still noted severe physical and emotional exhaustion. 2 police officers were on duty at the door of her room, and reporters crowded the corridor, held back by hospital security. Everyone was waiting for one thing: for the only witness to speak. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Detective Mark Golden of the Park County Sheriff's Office and Special Agent Sarah Vance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation entered the room. The first interrogation lasted almost 4 hours, with breaks necessary for the victim to rest. Tiffany's story, recorded on a dictaphone, was so detailed and horrifying that even experienced investigators felt cold listening to her quiet, hoarse voice. According to Tiffany, the fatal mistake happened on the second day of the hike, August 15th. Around noon, she and Richard decided to leave the official Slough Creek Trail. Richard, being an enthusiastic photographer, noticed a picturesque unnamed creek flowing down the gorge slope and wanted to take some unique shots away from the tourist routes. They went about a mile deep into the forest when they smelled smoke. Coming to a small clearing hidden behind a wall of dense spruce, they came across what Tiffany described as an illegal camp. It wasn't a tourist tent, but a dirty tarp and branch structure with animal bones and piles of garbage scattered around it. Before the couple could retreat, the owner of the camp appeared from behind the trees. Tiffany described the attacker as a white man in his 50s or 60s, with a gray, tousled beard and a crazy look. He was wearing old military camouflage that looked like it hadn't been washed in months. He was holding a hunting rifle with a telescopic sight. He did not let them say a word, immediately pointing the weapon at Richard. The man behaved erratically, shouting accusations that they were government spies who had come to take his land and freedom. At rifle point, he forced the couple to drop their backpacks and walk ahead of him deep into the forest. Tiffany recalled how they walked for several hours over rough terrain, stumbling and falling, but the man kept urging them on with blows from his rifle butt. In the evening, they reached a deep ravine with steep slopes. There, the kidnapper tied their hands behind their backs with rough plastic ties and tied them to tree trunks a few yards apart. According to Tiffany, the tragedy culminated at dawn on August 17th. Richard, who had been trying to grind the plastic against the sharp bark of a pine tree all night, managed to free his hands. When the kidnapper retreated into the bushes, probably to relieve himself, Richard whispered to his wife, "I'll hold him off. Run to the road and don't look back." Tiffany told investigators that she saw her husband lunge at the armed maniac with his bare hands. She heard the sounds of a struggle and the kidnapper's scream. Seizing the moment, she ran up the ravine, tearing her face on the thorny bushes. She had run no more than 100 yards when a loud gunshot rang out behind her. Immediately afterward, she heard Richard's scream, full of pain, cut off abruptly. Then there was silence. The woman claimed she did not remember how long she had been running. Fear drove her forward, forcing her to ignore her fatigue and hunger. For 5 days, she wandered through the forests, hiding in holes and under tree roots, afraid that the hunter was on her trail. She drank water from puddles and ate berries, not knowing if they were edible. It was only by a miracle that she managed to get to the highway, where she was picked up by a logging truck driver. Based on her testimony, a police sketch artist immediately drew a detailed sketch of the suspect. The portrait of a man with crazy eyes and a gray beard was shown on all the news that evening. The press instantly nicknamed him the Wyoming Hunter. The story had a bombshell effect. There was a real panic in the states of Montana and Wyoming. Residents of the towns of Gardner, Cook City, and Silvergate began to buy weapons and ammunition in droves for self-defense. The tourist season was threatened with disruption. People canceled hotel reservations and refused to take excursions. The park rangers received dozens of calls from frightened tourists who thought there was an armed man in every bush. Police organized round-the-clock patrols on the roads, stopping and checking all suspicious vans and campers. Tiffany Miller has become a national heroine. Her story of her husband's self-sacrifice and his wife's miraculous rescue touched the hearts of millions. People brought flowers to the hospital and created support groups on social media. But while the public mourned Richard and prayed for Tiffany's health, Detective Golden left the hospital room with a strange feeling. He looked again at the victim's examination report, where the doctor described the nature of the scratches on her body, and frowned. Something in this heroic story did not match what forensic scientists usually see on the bodies of people who had been running through the wild forest for 5 days. On August 23, 2016, the operation to find the so-called Wyoming Hunter reached its climax. While the public was frozen in anticipation of news of the maniac's capture, anxious tension began to build at the investigation headquarters, caused not by the presence of the criminal, but by his complete absence. A combined SWAT team, reinforced by National Park Service rangers, had been combing the square of woods indicated by Tiffany Miller for 3 days. According to her detailed testimony, it was here, in a deep ravine 5 miles off the Slough Creek Trail, that the kidnappers' camp was located. She described huts made of branches, piles of garbage, animal bones, and the place where she and Richard were kept tied to trees. The commandos moved in a chain, checking every bush, every rock outcropping. They expected to find a bullet casing from the fatal shot, traces of a struggle, fragments of plastic ties, or, most importantly, Richard Miller's body. But the forest was sterile. There had been no sign of human presence in the clearing in recent weeks. The moss was pristine, the branches of the bushes intact. The metal detectors were silent. Not a single shell casing, not a single bullet, not a single forgotten knife or can. Dogs trained to search for human remains and gunpowder gases circled the perimeter without giving any signals. In his report, the commander of the SWAT team wrote down the phrase that became the first wake-up call for the detectives. The area does not match the description of the crime. No one was running, shooting, or dying here. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, in Billings, Montana, Detective Robert Carter began to look into the other side of the tragedy, the couple's personal lives. On the surface, the Millers looked like a couple from a glossy magazine, young, successful, and in love with travel. Neighbors and colleagues unanimously claimed that it was a perfect marriage. However, when detectives began asking uncomfortable questions behind closed doors, the facade of the perfect family began to crumble. A colleague of Richard's at the architectural firm, who wished to remain anonymous, said during the interrogation that Richard was a pathological controller. According to her, he demanded that his wife account for every cent she spent. Tiffany was supposed to keep all the receipts from supermarkets and gas stations, and at the end of the month, Richard would compare them with bank statements. He controlled her phone calls, her social circle, and even her clothing choices. She couldn't breathe without his permission, the witness said in the report. But the real bomb went off when investigators checked Tiffany's phone records and geolocation a month before the trip. On July 14, 2016, her phone was recorded in the Billings Business Center, in a building that housed the well-known Stone & Partners law firm, which specializes in divorce proceedings. Investigators immediately contacted the firm's principal partner, Mr. James Stone. Referring to a court order, the lawyer was forced to confirm the fact of the consultation. He said that Tiffany Miller had indeed come to him to learn about the prospects of divorce. She was scared and looking for a way to get out from under her husband's total control. But the news was disappointing. The marriage contract, drawn up by Richard's father's lawyers, was so rigid that if the wife initiated the divorce, she would be left without housing and livelihood. The only clause that provided for significant payments was the death of one of the spouses as a result of an accident. While the detectives in Billings were digesting this information, in Cody, forensic pathologist Dr. Alan Grant was completing a detailed examination of Tiffany Miller. He sat in his office, looking at photographs of the injuries on the patient's body, and the longer he looked, the more doubts he had. In his preliminary report, Grant noted a glaring discrepancy between the victim's story and objective medical evidence. Tiffany claimed that she was running in a panic through a dense forest to escape an armed pursuer. Anyone who has ever tried to run through Yellowstone's coniferous undergrowth without a trail knows that this inevitably leads to deep lacerations, bruises on the shins and knees from hitting fallen trunks, and torn clothing where it comes into contact with branches. In contrast, the scratches on Tiffany's arms and legs were surprisingly superficial and orderly. Most of them were vertical, thin lines, as if she had walked slowly through the bushes, carefully pushing branches apart, or even deliberately inflicted them on herself to simulate a struggle with nature. There were no characteristic bruises from falls, which are inevitable when running across rough terrain in a state of affect. The injuries are static, not dynamic, the expert wrote dryly in his report. The results of the biochemical blood test were even more suspicious. Tiffany claimed to have spent 5 days in the woods without food or water, suffering from heat during the day and cold at night. In such a scenario, her blood sodium, potassium, and creatinine levels would have reached critical, life-threatening levels. Her kidneys would have started to fail. However, the tests showed only moderate dehydration, typical of a person who has not drunk water for about a day, up to a maximum of 36 hours. The level of electrolytes was reduced, but not catastrophically. This was physiologically impossible for a 5-day survival marathon. Her body was not dying. It was just tired. Detective Mark Golden, after receiving the report from the search team, the report from Billings on the visit to the lawyer, and Dr. Grant's medical report, felt a chill run down his spine. He stood in the hospital corridor, looking at the closed door of the room where the national heroine lay. One thought was running through his mind. If there was no camp, no shell casings, and no maniac in the ravine, who was she running from? And the worst question of all, why was her body acting as if she hadn't survived 5 days in the wild forest, but was just waiting? Golden pulled out his phone and dialed the number of the search team leader. "Square up in the ravine," he said in a quiet but firm voice. "We're looking in the wrong place, and it seems we're not looking for what we thought we were looking for." The detective hung up the phone and headed for the exit, realizing that the only objective witness in the case was now lying in the crime lab, covered in blood, and that he was about to speak the language of numbers and coordinates. On August 24, 2016, the center of gravity of the investigation shifted from the forests of Wyoming to the sterile offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Digital Forensics Laboratory in Denver, Colorado. While Tiffany Miller continued to play the victim at Cody Hospital and Detective Golden tried to piece together the puzzle of circumstantial evidence, on the desk of senior technical expert Michael Vance was an object that was supposed to put the story to rest. It was the same Garmin iTrex GPS navigator that the medics had struggled to remove from Tiffany's hand on the highway. The device looked like a foreign body among the chrome equipment and monitors in the lab. Its yellow, rubberized body was covered with a layer of dirt, and the buttons and cracks on the screen still held brown traces of dried blood, which, according to preliminary data, belonged to Richard Miller. For experts, this piece of plastic and chips was a black box similar to those searched for after airplane crashes. The data extraction procedure began at 11 o'clock in the morning. Vance connected the device to a secure terminal through a special gateway to prevent any changes to the gadget's memory. The green light on the navigator's body blinked, signaling that the connection was established. The inscription, "Downloading tracks," appeared on the monitor screen. What the experts saw in the next few minutes completely turned the course of the investigation around and turned the heroine into the main suspect. Tiffany Miller's first lie was exposed even before the experts opened the card. In her testimony, she categorically claimed that she had grabbed her husband's navigator in the confusion of the escape, and it was turned off or discharged, so she could not use it for orientation. However, the device's system log showed otherwise. According to the digital protocol, the power of the navigator was turned on at 9 o'clock in the morning on August 14th, at the beginning of the route, and was not turned off even once during the entire 7 days. The device worked continuously, recording every second, every stop, and every change in altitude until it was removed by paramedics. Someone carefully replaced the batteries on about the 3rd day so that the electronic eye would not close. When Vance superimposed the resulting GPS track on a topographic map of Yellowstone Park, a second, even more frightening truth was revealed. Tiffany had described her escape as a chaotic, panicked run through the thicket, where she didn't make out the road, guided only by fear. If this were true, the line on the map would have resembled a tangled ball, with sudden changes of direction, loops and turns. But the monitor showed a completely different picture. The line of movement was strikingly smooth and logical. It was not the path of a victim running away from a maniac. It was the route of an experienced tourist who knows where he is going. The track confidently skirted difficult obstacles such as swamps and thick winds and led from one freshwater source to another. Speed analysis showed that the object was moving at an average speed of 2.5 miles per hour. A calm, measured step of a person who saves energy and is in full control of the situation. No jerks, no panic. The third discovery made the agents freeze. On the third day after the disappearance, August 17th, when, according to Tiffany, she had been running for 2 days without feeling her legs from an armed pursuer, the navigator recorded a long stop. The point on the map was frozen for 14 hours. It happened in the area of the Baronet Peak Cliffs, in a place as far away from any official hiking trails as possible. It was a dead end, a perfect hiding place. Logic told the investigators a simple truth. A person running from a killer does not go to sleep for 14 hours in one place unless he or she feels completely safe. This stop was not a forced pause for the wounded victim. It was a cold-blooded wait. Tiffany wasn't wandering. She was biding her time, probably watching the search helicopters from her hiding place. But the most terrifying clue was hidden in the altimeter data, a device that measures altitude. While analyzing the graph for August 16th, the day of the alleged murder, Michael Vance noticed an anomaly that prompted him to urgently call his department head. At 14 hours and 12 minutes on August 16th, the device recorded a sharp change in altitude. The graph, which had previously fluctuated smoothly in accordance with the terrain, suddenly plummeted downward in a straight line. The recorded drop was 260 feet, almost 80 meters, in a matter of minutes. This was not a descent on foot. It was a fall. However, the navigator did not crash. Immediately after the fall, the point froze at the bottom of a deep gorge for about 20 minutes. And then the reverse process began. A slow, difficult climb up the same trajectory, which took more than 40 minutes. The picture of the crime was emerging with mathematical precision. Someone, and now the investigation understood who, had fallen or been thrown into the abyss with the navigator. But then another person went down to the bottom of the gorge. Not to help, because it is impossible to survive a fall from such a height. The person came down, spent 20 minutes near the body, took the navigator, and went back up. It was at this point that the experts remembered the blood that had caked between the buttons of the device. It was not the blood from Tiffany's superficial wounds. It was the blood of a man who was lying at the bottom of the canyon, smashed against the rocks. The navigator was there, in the epicenter of death. And Tiffany Miller was not going down there to save her husband, but to take the only device that could get her out of the forest. And probably to make sure Richard was silenced forever. Agent Vance printed out a map with the final coordinates. The point where the abrupt drop in altitude occurred was in the Yellowstone River Canyon area, a sector that search teams had not even considered because it lay far from the escape route described by the widow. The electronic witness did not just expose the lie. He drew a direct line to Richard Miller's grave. On August 25, 2016, the vector of the police operation changed instantly and radically. while just a day earlier, hundreds of people were combing the forest in search of the mythical hunter from Wyoming. Now, a small tactical team of 6 people had a completely different task. They were not looking for a criminal. They were going to check the coordinates of a lie. The data received from the navigator pointed to a specific point on the map, the inaccessible slope of Baronet Peak, located in the northeastern part of Yellowstone Park. It was there, according to the digital trail, that the device spent 14 hours motionless, while the entire state prayed for the rescue of the unfortunate victim. The operation began at 6 o'clock in the morning. The team consisted of 2 detectives from the sheriff's office, 2 federal agents, and 2 experienced ranger climbers. The climb up to the point was grueling. Steep, rocky scree alternated with dense juniper thickets, through which they had to cut through with machetes. The area was chosen perfectly for someone who does not want to be found. It offered a panoramic view of the valley, which made it possible to control the movement of the search teams while remaining invisible to observers from below. At 11 o'clock and 40 minutes, the group reached the set coordinates. They saw a picture that finally destroyed the legend of Tiffany Miller. It was not the camp of a crazy kidnapper with huts and animal bones. It was a natural niche in the rock, no more than 5 feet deep, the entrance to which was skillfully disguised by freshly cut pine branches. The branches had not been cut with a knife, but carefully broken off to make the break look natural. It was the work of a man who thought clearly and in cold blood. When the ranger pulled back his disguise and shone his flashlight inside, the detective saw what the reports would call a rookery. A place to sit had been carefully cleared on the stone floor. There was a life-saving isothermal blanket spread out, a shiny foil that was not on the list of stolen items Tiffany had claimed. This meant that she had it with her and had concealed this fact. But the most important evidence was lying nearby, turning the version of starvation and dehydration into a farce. In a small recess in the cave wall, investigators found 5 empty packages of high-calorie energy gels from the GU Energy brand. Each package contains enough carbohydrates to sustain a marathon runner's strength. While Tiffany was telling doctors about eating berries and drinking from puddles, she was actually sitting in a dry shelter and systematically maintaining her energy balance. Next to her was a half-empty liter bottle of factory-made water, which she probably also hid during her escape. But the real shock awaited the detectives when they began to examine the personal belongings left in this makeshift camp. Under the edge of the blanket was a small notebook with a black leather cover. It was an ordinary notebook that tourists often take with them to make notes about the route. But the notes made by Tiffany Miller's hand did not describe the beauty of nature. It was a script, a detailed, cynical plan for her own salvation. The detective, who was flipping through the pages with rubber gloves, felt his hair standing on end from what he was reading. There was one word on the page dated August 17th. Wait. On the next page, dated August 19th, the handwriting became more fluid. Helicopters are close. Sit quietly. Do not leave before sunset. But the most incriminating was the entry dated August 20th, made the day before she appeared on the highway. It contained a terrifying instruction to herself. Day 5. Put mud on my face and hands. Tear the t-shirt on the shoulder. Look convincing. The last point of the plan, marked with the date of August 21st, sounded like the director's final remark. Go to the highway. 6 in the morning. Fog. Perfect time for a meeting. In the corner of the cave, they also found nail scissors with traces of blue fabric fibers. Experts on the scene confirmed that the cuts on Tiffany's clothes, which she claimed were the result of running through the thicket, were made with this tool. She had methodically reduced her gear to rags while sitting in safety and warmth, preparing for her Oscar-winning appearance in front of the logging truck driver. The information about the discovery was immediately reported to the headquarters. The stop command for the search teams sounded at 12 o'clock 15 minutes. The myth of the hunter died there, in a cave on the slope of Baronet Peak. All that remained was the naked, ugly truth about a woman who had calculated every step of her life, except for one. She underestimated the technology she carried in her pocket. At 18 o'clock that afternoon, Detective Mark Golden, accompanied by a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent, entered the hospital in Cody. The atmosphere in the hallway changed instantly. The police officers guarding the victim's room were ordered to move away from the door. Holding a folder with photos of the cave and copies of notebook pages, Golden pushed open the door to room 304. Tiffany Miller sat on her bed, looking out the window. She was still playing the role of a weak, broken woman. When she saw the detectives, she tried to feign concern, asking in a shaky voice if there was any news about Richard. Golden did not answer. He silently walked over to the bed and laid out the photos in front of her. The cave, the gel wrappers, the notebook. For a moment, the room was dead silent. Only the humming of medical devices could be heard. Tiffany looked at the pictures, and the mask of suffering began to slip from her face, revealing something cold and predatory. She realized the game was up. Detective Golden, keeping his voice low, spoke the standard arrest formula. Tiffany Miller, you are under arrest on suspicion of obstruction of justice and perjury. You have the right to remain silent. When metal handcuffs were snapped onto her wrists, where doctors had been carefully treating fake scratches yesterday, Tiffany did not say a word. She didn't cry, didn't shout her innocence. She just looked up at the detective, and there was no fear in her eyes, only irritation that her perfect plan had been thwarted. However, she did not know the main thing. The police had found not only the place where she was hiding. Thanks to the same navigator, they already knew where she was going down the day her husband died. Although Tiffany remained silent, the detectives realized that the worst discovery was yet to come. On August 26, 2016, the atmosphere in the interrogation room of the Park County Sheriff's Office became so thick you could cut it with a knife. Tiffany Miller, backed into a corner by the physical evidence found in her hideout on the slope of Baronet Peak, realized that silence was no longer golden. Her legend of a heroic escape from a maniac had crumbled to dust, and now she needed a new story. One that could explain the presence of a dead body without landing her in the electric chair. Under the pressure of the detectives, who methodically laid out the facts of the lie in front of her, the woman broke down. She cried again, but this time they were not the tears of a victim, but of an accused trying to bargain for her life. Tiffany changed her testimony. She stated that Richard's death was the result of self-defense. According to her new version, her husband, known for his despotic nature, made a scene of jealousy with her on the edge of a cliff. He allegedly began to strangle her, threatening to throw her down, and she instinctively pushed him away in defense of her life. Richard lost his balance and fell into the abyss. Afraid that no one would believe her because there were no witnesses, she ran away and made up a story about the kidnapping. This version could have worked. Juries often sympathize with women who are victims of domestic violence. However, Tiffany Miller again underestimated her main enemy, the digital data stored in the navigator's memory. The electronic witness had no emotions. It operated only with coordinates and altitude, and these numbers painted a picture of a cold-blooded execution. not a spontaneous defense. Investigators superimposed the coordinates recorded by the device on the day of Richard's death, August 16th, on a detailed three-dimensional map of Yellowstone Park. The X point, where the architect's life ended, was not on a hiking trail, or even near one. It was a section of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River, known among rangers as the Devil's Sector. It's a place where tourists almost never go because of the fragile rock and sheer cliffs that plunge hundreds of feet down. It was impossible to get there by accident. You could only come there on purpose, with a clear goal in mind. Reconstructing the events based on the altimeter and accelerometer data from the navigator, the chronology of the murder was reconstructed to the minute. Tiffany knew her husband's passion for spectacular photographs. She deliberately brought him to this dangerous ledge, the perfect place for an accident. The device's data did not record any chaotic movements characteristic of a struggle or strangulation. On the contrary, the device had been at rest for about 5 minutes before the fall. Richard was probably setting up the camera or posing with his back to the abyss. The jolt was sharp and unexpected. But the most frightening discovery awaited the investigators next. An analysis of the altitude profile showed that Richard did not die instantly. The fall occurred on a ledge 80 feet below the cliff edge, not at the very bottom of the canyon. And then the navigator started moving. The altimeter recorded a slow, careful descent. It was not a device that fell with the body. It was Tiffany going down. She didn't run to find help, didn't call the rescue service, even though the satellite beacon could have picked up a signal. It took her 20 minutes to get down to where her husband had fallen. The data showed that she spent exactly 18 minutes on that shelf below. Why did she go down? The answer came from the forensic scientists who examined the device itself. The blood caked in the crevices of the case was Richard's, but the way it got on the device indicated splatter from an impact, not bleeding from a fall. The scenario was terrifying in its rationality. After the fall, Richard was alive, possibly unconscious or severely injured, but alive. Tiffany didn't come down to administer first aid. She went down to get his navigator, the only thing that guaranteed her safe exit from this maze of rocks. Without the GPS, she could have died alone. After taking the device, she realized she could not leave him alive. The testimony of her injured husband would have ruined her life and deprived her of insurance benefits. Investigators concluded that it was during those 18 minutes at the bottom of the gorge that she took a stone and finished off her husband, hitting him until he stopped breathing. The device was in her hand at the time, or lying very close by, recording the moment of death as another point on the map. After that, the ascent began. The altitude graph slowly crept upward. She scrambled back to the edge of the canyon, leaving her mangled body on a ledge where it was not visible from above and difficult for predators to reach. She acted calculatingly and cynically. Her subsequent actions, waiting in the cave for a week, feigning exhaustion, and eating a diet of energy gels, were part of the same plan. She needed to buy time for her body to begin to decompose and for her own appearance to arouse pity rather than suspicion. Detective Golden, looking into the eyes of the handcuffed woman in front of him, asked only one question. Why hadn't she thrown away the navigator? The answer was read in her silence. She was a city dweller who was terrified of getting lost. The fear of dying in the forest was stronger than the killer's caution. She clung to that piece of plastic as a life preserver, not realizing that it would become an anchor that would drag her down. Now that the police had the exact coordinates of the crash site, the operation entered its final phase. A group of rescue climbers began preparing equipment for a difficult descent into the Devil's Sector. They knew where to look. They knew they would see injuries incompatible with a simple fall. But none of them realized that Richard Miller, even when he was dead, had one last surprise for his wife, waiting for them in his jacket pocket. On September 28, 2016, the final point in the story that kept the entire state of Wyoming in suspense was not put in a courtroom, but at the bottom of a gloomy stone trap. At precisely 7:30 in the morning, an elite National Park Service search team of 5 of the most experienced climbers and 2 forensic scientists arrived at the rim of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. They were holding a map with coordinates extracted from the navigator's memory. These numbers pointed to a point 80 feet below the level of the observation deck, in the so-called blind sector, which cannot be seen from the air or from hiking trails. The descent into the abyss was technically challenging and dangerous. The climbers used double belaying, slowly descending the fragile rock of the steep wall. Below, at a depth of hundreds of feet, the river roared, and the cold wind, which is always walking in the canyon, tried to tear people off the slope. At 10:15, the first rescuer touched his feet to a narrow stone ledge. A moment later, the radio at the top came to life. The climber's voice was dry and devoid of emotion. Visual contact confirmed. Object found. Richard Miller's remains were wedged between the canyon wall and a large boulder. But this was not the position of a person who had simply fallen. The body was partially covered with stones, juniper branches, and earth. Nature does not create such structures. It was a grave hastily constructed by human hands. Whoever did this tried to disguise the bright orange color of the deceased's jacket so that he would not be seen from the helicopter. This fact finally confirmed that someone was with Richard after he fell. An initial examination of the body on the spot by a forensic scientist who followed the team down revealed a horrific skull injury. The occipital bone was crushed. The nature of the damage indicated a strong, purposeful blow with a heavy, blunt object, rather than a blow to a flat surface during a fall. A stone with traces of a brown substance was found near the body, which was seized as a possible murder weapon. The procedure of lifting the body lasted more than 5 hours. When the special container was finally brought to the surface, investigators began to examine the personal belongings that were in the pockets of the victim's clothes. In the inside pocket of the storm jacket, they found an item that became the most important evidence in the case: Richard Miller's smartphone. The device was in a professional waterproof and shockproof case, which saved the electronics from moisture and mechanical damage. The phone was delivered to the laboratory the same evening. After charging the battery, the experts gained access to the gallery of media files. The last file was a video recording made on August 16, 2016, at 14 hours and 12 minutes. This was 2 minutes before the GPS sensors recorded the fatal drop in altitude. This video, which would later be broadcast in the courtroom, shocked even the cynical defense lawyers. On the screen, Richard Miller was standing on the edge of the same ledge. The sun was shining, and the wind was tussling his hair. He looked absolutely happy and calm. The man held the camera in front of him, shooting a panorama of the majestic canyon, and then turned the lens on himself. His last words to his wife sounded clear. "Tiff, it's just stunning here. You picked a great spot. The view is incredible. Come here, let's take a photo together. Don't be afraid, it's safe here." In the background of the recording, we hear the sound of footsteps on gravel and Tiffany's voice approaching. "I'm coming, honey. Stay there and don't move. I want to take a picture of you." The video cuts off. This recording crossed the entire line of defense. The version of self-defense, of a quarrel, of Richard attacking his wife and trying to strangle her, turned out to be a cynical lie. The video showed no fear, no aggression, no tension. Richard trusted his wife completely. He admired the place she chose for his execution. She lured him to the edge of the cliff with flattery and a request for a photo, and then coldly pushed him in the back. The trial of Tiffany Miller began in April 2017 in the Park County District Court. The prosecutor built the case on 3 pillars: the GPS data of the navigator, which proved her presence at the murder scene and manipulation of the altitude; the found cache of food, which refuted the legend of wandering; and, finally, Richard's dying video, which proved the premeditation of the defendant's actions. During the hearings, Tiffany behaved distantly, looking at one point. She no longer cried or tried to evoke pity. When the prosecutor showed the jury the Garmin navigator, she closed her eyes for just a moment. This little yellow device, which she had clutched so tightly in her hand on the highway, thinking it was her ticket to a new, rich life, became her sentence. She had kept it so she wouldn't get lost in the woods, but it was the device that brought justice right to her. On May 20, 2017, the jury, after 3 hours of deliberation, announced the verdict: guilty of aggravated first-degree murder. The judge, reading out the verdict, called the crime an act of exceptional cruelty and calculation. Tiffany Miller was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Today, years after the tragedy, the Slough Creek Trail remains a popular route. Hikers passing by the turnoff to the canyon rarely realize the drama that played out here one August day. But among park rangers, the story of the coordinates of lies has become a legend. It reminds us that in the digital age, there are no perfect crimes. The Yellowstone Canyon can swallow up a body, hide evidence, and wash away traces with rain. But it cannot erase the digital traces left behind by human cruelty. Richard Miller is dead, but the technology he loved so much has given him a voice from beyond the grave to name his killer.